Number one, the first thing about David's faith is the object of his faith. The object of his faith. Look back at verse 32. Because in verse 32, David essentially says, let me go fight Goliath. Let me do it. Nobody else wants to fight Goliath. I want to. Let me go fight Goliath. But then Saul says in verse 33, essentially, you can't fight Goliath. You're just a kid, and he is a seasoned soldier. He's a warrior with experience. He'll beat you to a bloody pulp. Well, that's ad-libbing a little bit, all right? But that's essentially what he said. But David's mind goes back to the past. And David begins to tell King Saul the story about how while he was watching his father's sheep, he was able to defeat a lion and a bear. But David begins to tell King Saul about what took place when he was protecting his father's sheep. And then in verse 37, David goes on and he gives God all the credit. He says, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. Please make a mental note that God was the object of David's faith. God was. Reflecting back on those two incidents, David knew that it wasn't his wisdom, it wasn't his strength that had given him the victory over the lion and the bear, but rather without God, it would have never happened. And he was standing there in front of Saul, and he was looking at Saul saying, I want you to know my faith is in God. And I'll tell you why. Because God helped me with that lion, and God helped me with that bear, and I'm believing that God's going to help me with this giant called Goliath. Now, here's a thought that you need to write down. The victories that God gave us in the past are meant to help strengthen our faith for the challenges that we're facing today. Don't waste all those things that have happened in your past. Look back at those victories that were won. Look back at what God has done in your life and say, well, I believe that God's going to do it again today because he did it yesterday. And he did it back then whenever I faced this. And he got me through that valley. And he helped me to overcome that giant in my life. And that's the reason I'm standing here today. And so I'm going to continue to trust and I'm going to believe that God is the one who will deliver me through this valley. Someone has well said, you may not want to hear it, but here it is. We face challenges in life in order that we might face greater challenges in life. Did you get that? We face challenges in life in order that we might face greater challenges in life. God's taking you through the things right now that you're going through in your life so that he can take you through even greater things in the future. Think about it, because David's encounter with the lion and the bear prepared him for his encounter with Goliath. By this point, David was fully convinced of the power of God, and he truly believed with every fiber of his being that God could do that which we label as being humanly impossible. And then in verse 28, David's oldest brother, Eliab, essentially says to him, are you nuts? I'm doing a lot of paraphrasing today. Are you nuts? What number one, what are you even doing here? You're just here trying to figure out what's going on with this battle. He says, are you nuts? You're talking about going and fighting. There's not a soldier here. You're inexperienced. You're not even a soldier. You're a shepherd. And you're saying you're going to go fight this seasoned giant named Goliath. Are you nuts? Verse 33, King Saul essentially says, you're crazy. His oldest brother says, you're nuts. Saul says, man, you're crazy. I'm bigger than you are. I'm the biggest guy here. Nobody's taller than I am in Israel, and I'm not going to go fight Goliath. What in the world are you talking about fighting Goliath? And then in verse 42, Goliath essentially says, you don't have what it takes, little boy. You coming out here, sort of like, you want a piece of me? You know, that's what he's saying. He's saying, come on. So you don't have what it takes. But David had faith in God. He had faith in God. As a matter of fact, he didn't really see this as a battle between him and Goliath, but rather a battle between his God and Goliath. That's why in verse 46, David says, this day will the Lord deliver you into mine hand. He didn't say, hey, you're going to see what I'm made of. I'm telling you, you're way underestimating my power and my ability. No, he didn't say that. He said, God's going to do this. God's going to do it. The Lord is going to deliver you, Goliath, into mine hand. I like that word will, because it means that in David's mind there was no doubt. It was almost like it was a done deal. He was fully convinced and he was confident that God was able to defeat Goliath. David's eyes were not fixed on Goliath, but rather his eyes were fixed on God, the one who was greater than the giant that he was facing. My friend, the same must be true of us today. You may be down in the valley of Elah right now. So what do you mean by that? Well, I mean that right now you might be facing a giant of your own. Oh, it's not maybe a real literal giant like Goliath, but you've labeled it as a giant. You've labeled it as something impossible. You've labeled it as a mountain so high that you don't think you're going to be able to get over it. You've labeled whatever that is in your life as a giant. You're dealing with a giant. You're facing a giant today, just like David was facing the giant down in the valley of Elah. If you're down in that valley, you have a choice. That valley of Elah in your life will either become a valley of fear or it will become a valley of faith. One or the other. Saul and the army of Israel, it was a valley of fear. The valley of Elah, where you had the Philistines on the south side on the mountain and the Israelites on the north side. And as they looked down and they heard him cry out day after day for 40 days, send me somebody to fight me. If they beat me, we'll be your slaves. If we win, then you will be our slaves. They heard that intimidating cry day after day after day after day. It got to the place to where their hearts were overcome with fear. They had convinced themselves this battle was not going to be won. But then there was David. And David was a man of faith. He was a man who believed that God could do the miraculous. He believed that God could do what he couldn't do. Do you believe that this morning? I believe that God can do what we cannot do. And he had faith in God. And you know the rest of the story. Goliath came crashing down to the ground. The object of our faith. What are you trusting today? I don't know what you're facing, what giant it is. You label that giant in your life right now. It could be anything, and I have no idea what it might be in your life, but God does. And you have a choice as you go through that valley of Elah. Are you going to be a man or a woman of faith, or are you going to be overcome by fear?